Thank you, Sandra. Okay, before I start, we'll check into the, what would we call it, integrity of the group. How many noticed the misspelling? 200 people trained to look at fine detail. I have to admit, I didn't know until one of the waiters pointed it out to me. But I had spell checker last few books, so that gave me a fighting chance. Apparently I don't on this. Anyway, thank you all for inviting me here, letting me be part of your program. What I wanted to do today is give you exposure to a little different twist in trace evidence, explaining what we do in wildlife and more specifically what our laboratory is doing right now. But to start out with, I've got to go through a few definitions, make sure we're all on the same page. And I think hopefully everybody out there agrees that trace evidence is a term used to describe small, oftentimes microscopic physical evidence. We also probably all agree that trace evidence is a discipline of forensic science accredited by Askeladd Lab. And we're probably all aware that a laboratory must apply for accreditation in all disciplines in which Askeladd Lab provides accreditation and the laboratory provides services. This became an issue to us. We do conduct trace evidence, that is analysis of trace evidence. We've got a comparison microscope, and we've got a fairly comprehensive hair collection of mammals all across the world. We even have in our organizational structure a clear box, a section, morphology, where identification and comparison of hair takes place. But, as for those of you who know about our laboratory, that section also deals with hides, fur, feathers, claws, teeth, shells, scales, horns, tusks, bones, and skulls. This became an issue during our first Askeladd Lab inspection. They sent out, the good old Askeladd Directorate sent out, I believe it was 3 DNA experts and 1 trace expert to inspect us. And I'm sure that trace expert was expecting to find our hair collection and maybe some glass or paint chips. He clearly wasn't expecting to find that. This is our version of trace. That inspection came to a rapid halt as the team regrouped. We don't really fit into the standard Askeladd definition of trace, much less anything else, I'm beginning to think. But it did become an issue because our definition of trace is really a part or product, for example, of an elephant, because it isn't the whole elephant, depending on how you want to define an elephant. And that's really a problem to us. You know, it's, that elephant foot's pretty obvious, even though it's, you know, just 1 of 4 on the bottom end of the elephant. But it's not obvious at all you got an elephant if you've got that leather bag or the carved ivory. So what we have to do as a laboratory is figure out what our victim is based on that piece, that part, that product, before we can ever go forward with our investigations. These definitions are going to be a little bit more of a problem for us, probably a substantial one, when we leave legacy and we go to ISO. Because as I'm sure all of you are aware, definitions are extremely important. I know what an elephant is. I'm guessing that most of you out there would agree you know what an elephant is. I might have some questions about juries, but that's a whole separate issue. An elephant's pretty well defined, at least when you've got the whole thing. But when you get to a wolf, defining what a wolf is or isn't is a trick for us, because the law really says canis lupus, you know, this creature is to be protected. And the definition is basically, well, what is a wolf now has always been a wolf. It doesn't take into account the evolutionary process. It doesn't take into account that way back when the wolf-like creatures split off, domestic dogs started appearing, and then you had hybridness. And when you add hybridness to the mix, where do we go to find a pure wolf that we know 100 generations back has no domestic or wild dog in its mix? Second question, of course, is how could we possibly know? Because it comes down to definition. So I'm not sure where ISO is going to take us, or possibly boot kick us out the door, but we're sure going to make an effort. My view of the whole accreditation process is I want oversight of our laboratory. We believe we're going to be ethical and honest and good scientists, but there's real value in having that accreditation process, keeping an eye on you. So we are going to work as hard as we can to maintain part of the group. Let's continue some definitions for a moment. CSI, the discipline of forensic science, optionally accredited by ASCLD Lab. CSI, also defined as a collection of trace or other evidence items within a defined boundary, that is a crime scene perimeter, for the purpose of reconstructing the events of a crime and linking suspect, victim, and crime scene. It's also a TV show, but we're not going to get into that. Whole separate issue. But it does bring us into a specific issue for us, which is CSI in a box. And there is one of the boxes. For reasons of bunny, among other things, culture, elephant tusks are prized, especially in Asia. Most of the elephant tusks, however, exist in the continent of Africa, where they're protected. So the trick for a poacher isn't just to shoot a large animal that's perfectly capable of stomping you into the dust, but you gotta get the tusks to Asia somehow without us, wildlife law enforcement officers and the wildlife subgroup of Interpol, noticing, tracking. In this case, the African game wardens, the rangers, were successful. They tracked this shipment, and they immediately popped the lid and started passing the tusk around, quite happy at their accomplishment. And it was a good accomplishment. It was a nice raid. But as we told them, if you hadn't opened those boxes, we might have been able to tell you where those tusks came from. Because these tusks there probably didn't come from the country where they were seized. We'd like to work our way back to the kill site, if possible. But to do that, we need to work those boxes as a crime scene, which means they need to stay shut. Had they stayed unopened for perfectly preserved crime scenes, opportunity using CSI techniques to determine country of origin, ID suspects, poachers, transporters, and buyers, and link suspect, victim, and crime scene together, all the stuff we're supposed to be able to do. Well, we got a new opportunity, thanks to a buddy of mine, Pete Younger, who was in charge of the wildlife crime unit of Interpol. Interpol, became aware of 4 metal boxes in transit. The reason they became aware was a fellow at an airport happened to realize the boxes were extremely heavy, wondered what was in them, observed the padlocks and the metal seals. It wasn't something they could easily inspect. Had them x-rayed and discovered elephant tusks. At this point, the decision by Pete was to run a controlled delivery, which is to say to follow the tusks along their route to see where they ended up. And the route, as you can see up here, Lusaka to Addis Ababa, to Bangkok, to Hong Kong, to Singapore, and at the next step, for lack of a better word, Pete decided he couldn't trust the next stopping point. The wildlife officers there to assist to maintain control of the delivery. At that point, he called me up and said, "Hi, remember all those things you said you could do with 4 locked boxes of tusks? Well, I got them. Do you want them?" To refresh your memory here, what they knew about the route, that's when they detected it, Zambia to Ethiopia, Bangkok, Hong Kong, Singapore, and headed up to an unnamed country, probably, I'm guessing, to China, because that's where the money is for these things. Why they took such a circuitous route is curious to us. Why they stayed in place for months during this whole time is also curious to us. It's part of the poaching smuggling system. We didn't care. We diverted the shipment, and I made this presentation, or at least part of this presentation, to Interpol a few months ago, and no one there was likely to understand where Ashland, Oregon was, so I showed them. And maybe there's a whole bunch of people here who aren't quite sure either. This is where we're located, in beautiful Ashland, Oregon, a town of about 17,000 people, couched in between two mountain ranges that come together at our southern border, right along the California-Oregon border. And that's our laboratory, the older part of our lab up front, the white, and the brand new part in gray behind it, which contains, among other things, a brand new Biolevel 3 containment facility, sadly to deal with bioterrorism, with sadly the idea that someone might deliberately infect a wild or domestic herd as a bioterrorist event, a game warden, conservation officer, one of our agents likely to come across the animals, and they might ship it to us to ask what was going on. Our pathologists are trained to recognize disease vector signs. They would normally have done the proper thing, which was simply kill the disease vector, because we would always viewed that before as Mother Nature, not a violation of wildlife law. We would have killed the disease vector and kept on going. There's a certain laboratory that I'm quite fond of called the FBI laboratory, who was very much aware of us and was very much aware of what we were doing. And when they heard about our Biolevel 3 facility, they said, wait, stop. We don't want you destroying it. We want to be able to track back. That helped cement the money for the Biolevel 3, and we're now equipped to handle things, we hope, with reasonable safety. But that's what we look like from front and back. So our 4 crime scenes are going to arrive. And fortunately, we have a forklift. It didn't occur to us that how heavy 4 trunks of dust might be. They're heavy. At this point, we made an interesting decision. We hadn't used our Biolevel 3 facility, fortunately. In fact, I'd like to cheerfully retire somewhere down the road and while it gathers dust. But it did occur to us that we probably should test it out to make sure everything worked as we expected, beyond the normal certification test. We didn't really expect these tests to be dangerous. They were in transit for several months. They'd flown high in the air. Everything in there should have been dead. So what I'm going to talk about here is the transport of the lab to the lab, the search and examination of our crime scenes, how we documented, how we collected, how we tagged, and how we distributed evidence amongst 2 laboratories. At this point, some of the evidence went to a friend of ours, Ed Espinoza, my chief scientist, and I have known Dave Stoney for a long time. He's got a really interesting lab going that makes use of trace evidence and huge databases and outside experts and cross-links the data to figure out where, let's say, a pair of boots might have been, and has the skill to really narrow it down to a very small area. Andy Bowen here is from the lab. He's here at the meetings today. You might want to track him down and ask more questions about that. Basically, Stoney, when he heard about our plans for this case, said, you know, I'd really like to try out some of our techniques. Do you mind if I help? We won't charge you anything. Sounded good to us. So we begin the process. We did this in the idea that we'd act as though there was something dangerous in one of those boxes, potentially anyway. So we'd set up the monitoring system. We'd work as we normally might work in that situation. At the same time, Pete Younger called up and was talking about all this. He said, you know, we could use some publicity on this case. We're not going to carry it any further. We have issues of chain, and there's a good chance it might be a government entity anyway that we're not going to be able to do anything about. If you know a good reporter, you know, feel free to bring him along. You know, this is one of the few cases we might like that. Okay, so the process begins. Back up. The search team inside is going to be my firearms examiner, myself, Dave Stoney, and Andy Reinholtz, late print examiner, and Ed Espinoza, chief scientist, deputy lab director, is going to stay outside to monitor the safety of the operation. We begin by the standard process of removing the outer wrappings. We assume these have been handled by all kinds of people, and anything we found on there just isn't going to be meaningful. We photograph the crime scene from the outside, as we might normally do. We're examining the exterior for signs of evidence. We're specifically looking for fingerprints, but still, we really aren't going to be too concerned about the outside of the box. What we're interested in is the inner contents. Opening the box involves some heavy-duty metal cutters because we not only had the metal bands, but we had 3 padlocks on each of the boxes. At this point, we're a little curious as to what these boxes might be. We thought they might be military, but they looked awful cheap to be military, and we couldn't figure out why the military would have locks on ammo boxes anyway. It's not likely anybody's going to steal from the military, we thought. We're opening the boxes up, and the first thing we find is some padding that's going to be some interesting evidence for us. Keep in mind that one of the things that Dave Stoney is going to be looking for is dust, pollen, plant material fragments, insect fragments, and the like. So we're photographing now. Mike and Andy they're both law enforcement officers. They're really not afraid of criminals and bullets and knives and things, but bugs apparently scare them to death. So they suited up a little more than obviously Dave and I did. We thought they were being a little paranoid, but that's okay. Removing the tusks, out there you'll notice, you can't tell which one's which, but we have a Medford Tribune reporter who does environmental articles, and he brought along a photographer. And he's making notes, the photographer's shooting away cheerfully, and we start looking and noticing what appears to be multiple impact points on the tusk coming from a downward direction. This doesn't look good to us because it suggests a helicopter, suggests the animals might have been rounded up with a helicopter and machine gun, and the people who would have that kind of equipment in Africa tend to be the military. This isn't necessarily something we want a Medford Tribune reporter noticing. So I managed to get word to Ed that he ought to just encourage the guys to take a few pictures and go on their way because nothing interesting is happening here. Although that was kind of shown not to be the truth because we have a whole bunch of our lab staff that are thoroughly intrigued by what's going on. Communications are crucial in something like this, and we, of course, didn't think about communications when we built our Bio-Level 3 facility. But good old Radio Shack has equipment that actually can get through a very well-sealed room, and it's working okay for a while. Do you know how hard it is to write a backward S in your mind? Yeah. Marking the tusks, that I can do. It's real simple, straightforward numbers. And as we're examining them, we're seeing what appear to be major bullet impacts, but we're starting to realize we're not really sure what is or isn't a bullet impact on these things. Mike, Andy, and I are intrigued by that, but Dave's got his own issues. He's there to collect the trace evidence, and he's carefully examining these tusks, intent on collecting what he said would be essentially a pickup bed full of evidence from his standpoint. We do the proper thing. We take pictures of all the tusks, inside and all, and Dave begins to collect the evidence. Which means he starts to scoop soil and materials out from the cavity of this tusk. And as he does so, a tiny red spider hops out. I leap backwards. Well, a very good reason why I leapt backwards. In Mother Nature, anything bright red Probably has fangs 3 times the size of its body. I probably should explain. I'm okay with this. I'm not okay with that. Much for being heroic. The terrifying little red spider collection process, which, by the way, my lab staff dearly love to watch, is to grab a piece of Scotch tape and stick a little bugger on it for later processing. We managed to get all the tests out of there. Well, by the way, we discovered that, well, one, obviously we were wrong about things not staying alive in there. 2, it was awfully nice that we were in BioLevel 3, because probably Ashland, Oregon doesn't really want a bright red spider leaping out our door and running amok in the environment. Not to mention anything else in there, but it turns out this little guy had made webs, and had been cheerfully eating the flies that were also in there, because we could see them where they were hauled out, and there were some fly larvae still alive in there. So much for assumptions. Anyway, we got everything contained. We got all the tests out here, and there's every sense that it's probably a family, a few large ones, several relatively young elephants. And several of the tests had to be apparently cut up to fit inside the boxes. Our initial summary, we have 75 tests. 27 appeared to be matched sets, that is, they looked like they went together. A guessing game at that point. 21 individual tests that we couldn't match together set. 74 were pretty obviously African, and 1 appeared to be Asian, which confused us thoroughly. Interestingly, 3 of the tests were charred. Some of you may remember years back, a country in Africa made a big display of burning a bunch of seized ivory by pouring gasoline on them and setting them on fire, allowing the photographers to take pictures and then shooing them away. Ed and I watched that with some degree of disbelief, because for us to burn a 1-inch cube of ivory takes 1,000 degrees for over an hour. I don't think you can keep a gasoline fire going for an hour without becoming part of the fire, much less keep it at 1,000 degrees. So my guess is there's a whole bunch of slightly charred ivory out there that's been buried and is being dug up and shipped. This may be part of this whole process. There's 4 tests on there that we're now saying is a probable bullet impact, because we're not sure at all, and 1 test that's human primate blood, and a test with red paint smear. And we're thinking, oh boy, we're having dreams of matching this to a Isuzu pickup, 1975 model. You all would do that. Why couldn't a wildlife lab do that? We'd impress somebody. We tag the evidence, as we properly should. We then distribute the evidence. We take the boxes, the tusks, the padding, the insects, and we give Dave the dirt, the pollen, and the plant fragments. Seemed like fair division to us. Latent print processing, you can get latent prints off of a elephant tusk. You have to modify the techniques a bit, which Andy has been having fun doing, but you end up getting perfectly usable latents off of the tusk, as well as inside the metal box. Although it's occurring to us, if this is a military situation, the people handling the boxes are probably the privates, not the colonels and generals that we'd like to get to. So that probably isn't going to do us much good in terms of getting standard sets of latents. The metal boxes were interesting to us because we looked at them closer, we realized they appeared to be handmade. They appeared to be made out of the same type of metal used to make HVAC duct. We made measurements. It was pretty obvious that the first 2 boxes were about the same size, probably a standard size for something. And the other 2 had been made bigger or smaller. The padlocks are Security 364, chrome-coated. We've done all kinds of searches. We have no idea where these locks came from. If anybody out there knows, we'd sure like to hear about it. The padding was interesting to us. There was a breakfast meal bag from Zambia, a white rice bag from Vietnam, a salt bag from Botswana, another bag of whatever it was from Zambia, and some kind of flour bag from we don't know where. But it's kind of giving us a clue, although it became obvious to us as well that there's lots of, merchants in Africa who import-export food, and the military would be expected to have their own sources of food and might be bagged as well. The impact marks on the tusk, we really wanted to know whether they were bullets or not. Some we thought, because of the sheer impact evidence, were pretty obviously high velocity something, and others could have been chop marks. So we decided to do some proper testing. What we did, this would be my chief scientist, I will blame him for this. We decided to use the type of rifle these guys, the poachers most likely used, essentially an AK-47 with AK-47 ammo. We put the tusk up against the berm. Mike stepped back 7 yards, fired a bullet at the tusk. The blowback was 10 yards. He was covered with ivory fragments, and the bullet tumbled over his head. Ha ha ha. We knew ivory was elastic. We didn't know it was that elastic. We stopped test firing pretty much immediately. But this is interesting to us because this is likely to tell us a lot about the kill site. Knowing, of course, these poachers generally don't want to hit the ivory. That's the whole reason they're going after the elephants in the first place. But this is giving us information for later investigations. As we do some checking on, we're looking at what we think are hatchet marks, machete marks, getting the cementum off of the tusk. That's the cementum that binds the tusk to the skull of the elephant. And we discovered something which I suppose we really knew deep in our minds, which was ivory makes a lovely tool mark impression from an edged blade. We'd have no problem at all matching that machete to that cut. And the same goes from the knife we tested. Less obvious, but the marks are still there. And the axe gave some really nicely defined marks. We continued with our investigation, doing a lot of work to try to figure out distance. What can we tell about these tusks? The whole idea is that we're going to try to work our way back to a kill site with our information and with Dave's. Ed decides that he's got to get at markings a little better, so he has to read the manual on how to work a pressure washing machine, but he figures that out, and we start cleaning the tusks. And we're starting to get more of a sense of impact points and angles, and a downward trajectory seems pretty likely, depending on whether the elephants are looking up or down or running. Lots of possibilities. But we're continuing to document all the impacts. We x-ray the tusk, and to no great surprise, there's no bullets penetrated and buried into the tusks. The paint smear was going to be fun for us. But it turns out to be water soluble, and I really doubt that they paint trucks with water soluble paint in Africa. The insects, these were found in the tusk cavities. We sent them to the Department of Entomology, Natural History Museum in London. And we got information back. One of the insects was a blowfly. Unfortunately, its range is pretty much throughout Africa, southern Europe, and the Middle East, and eastwards towards northwest India. So it's not really narrowing things down a whole lot for us, but it's a start. Dung flies, they turn out to be worldwide, as is dung, so I guess that doesn't come as much as a surprise. Army ants, that was kind of unnerving. The idea of working a crime scene with a dead elephant and suddenly finding yourself covered with army ants doesn't sound like a good deal. We're getting less enthusiastic about the whole idea of responding to these crime scenes. But their range is throughout Africa. Again, we're not narrowing things down very much. Sheep blowfly, widely ranged, even including Australia, Europe, and southern Africa. Okay, great. This little guy, we still have yet to hear. I think they're just not telling me. They don't want me to know. I'm going to find out someday. In the meantime, we talked Lawrence Livermore into doing some testing for us. They were quite happy to, as long as we gave them money. We wanted to get a sense of time of death. What we discovered was that two very individualistic tusks, that is, they have very individualistic wear marks on the end, came from an elephant killed between 1976 and 1978. And based on our hemoglobin dating, we've done a lot of work with hemoglobin, and we know how long the hemoglobin will stay active to our tests, indicated that the others were killed between 2000 and 2006. What we're really hoping with this pair of tusks is that somebody took a picture of this elephant, and we might be able to get at those pictures and enlarge and maybe at least have a rough idea of where that elephant was. So we've got these pictures of these tusks scattered throughout Africa. Evidence sent to Stoney Forensics. I tried to explain what he did, but my mind doesn't even begin to go where Stoney's does in terms of dealing with statistics and number crunching. What he did really amazed us. He had to stop about a third of the way through the process because he ran out of time and money of what he could do for us for free. But a third of the way there through his analysis, this is what he narrowed it down to. The white is where they didn't come from. The yellow-orange is where they could have. That's pretty good based on some pollen and some plant material analysis. And as he said, had he been able to spend more time and effort on it, probably could have narrowed it down not only to the country, but probably the province, the city, possibly even the field area, depending if there's a willow tree or not in a certain spot. As I said, Andy Bowden is from Stoney Forensics. He's here at the FBI Symposium today. You might grab him and ask him more questions about the process. So how are we going to apply these techniques in the future? We've got several ideas, but one of them is already in motion. I got to spend all of June in Africa a little while back, training about 45 African Rangers at the International Law Enforcement Academy in Gaborone in CSI techniques designed for wildlife investigations. A great group of, I'd say, guys, but one female ranger in there, the youngest of the group. We made her a team leader, and to our amazement, her team members immediately said, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. Turns out she's very good with a gun. Did the same thing at Kruger National Park in South Africa the following week. 2 weeks in Ilea in Gaborone, Botswana. 1 week in Kruger National Park. Same kind of training. After the training, we implemented a new kit for us. It's an elephant rhino kill site collection kit. The idea is we're going to collect soil for stable isotope analysis and DNA from the victim, with the idea that we've got two ways of tracking back on a rhino horn or a tusk, either through the DNA analysis if we get lucky, or possibly by soil associated with the kill site. It's an interesting process of arranging with customs and APHIS about sending possibly anthrax-ridden soil samples into the United States. But the fact that we have Bio-Level 3 and a USDA inspector nearby, this supposedly is all going to work. We shall see. But then we got a chance to do something, Pete Younger and I got a chance to do something that's fun for us. We got on a helicopter with the idea that we would try out these kits, or we would observe them, since Pete's from Interpol, he's not supposed to be investigating, and I'm not supposed to be investigating, but we can observe. So we made a nice helicopter ride out to the kill site, which is about 5 miles from the Mozambique border, where the poachers most likely came from. This is a picture probably I shouldn't have broadcast, because I'm really not supposed to be getting into uncertified planes or helicopters not certified by the federal government, but it was Africa. That's Pete Younger there with a blue arrow looking. He and I were having a lot of fun. It was a very interesting day. Flew over Kruger, gorgeous area, big, as you saw from the previous slide, some 7,000 square miles. We picked up Johan. The blue arrow indicates Johan's truck. His job is to patrol a roughly 500 square mile area by himself. He was aware these poachers were out after the specific Rhino. He was trying to get the government to give him more money to hire more rangers, but he couldn't. So he was out there pretty much 18 hours a day looking for the poachers while trying to keep track of the Rhino, and they got past him. Johan is many things here. He's large. The weapon, the assault rifle in his hand, looks like a little Mattel toy. When he shook my hand, I pretty much dropped to my knees. Very large, pissed off fellow. We are now at the kill site, according to the GPS reading, but it was getting pretty obvious to us that there was something wrong with either our GPS unit or the one that got the initial reading, because we don't see a dead Rhino anywhere. 45 minutes later, by the lovely technique of smell, we found the site. What we're basically doing is flying low. The rotor blades are kicking up air. You can use your imagination on that. You're all forensic scientists. You're past your lunch. I'm not going to worry about you. To discover a piece of trace evidence, our version. This is Johan's Rhino. He thought of it as his. He's not a happy man. That's where the horns were cut off. This is a process of marking the evidence. The Rhino's kind of far gone. It's about 6 days old at this point in terms of decomposition, but they want the bullet. In this case, the bullet went through the Rhino's left side, hit vital organs, went between ribs and embedded itself in the fatty tissue on the other side. Now, what you're going to be seeing for any firearms examiners in here, bullet examiners, you're going to shudder at this next slide, because this doesn't look like the implement you would normally use to get a bullet out of tissue. But these guys were good at what they did. They simply hacked the tissue that was around the bullet away, and ultimately used a piece of plastic to wedge the bullet out. So they really did the right thing. And you get to see Rhino Elephant Kill Site Evidence Collection Kit 0001 being used. I would have had less of a numbering system, but Kruger lost 105 rhinos last year. The sad likelihood is that our test kits are going to be well used. This is Johan listening to the report. He turns to me, he said, is all this information, all this stuff you collected going to help me find the poachers? And I said, well, I hope so in the future, yes. And his response was, gut, turned and walked away. Johan would be quite impressed if he were at this meeting to see all of your skills and backgrounds brought together. But he'd be asking you the same kind of question. And always we left him back to patrol. He's, I'm sure, still out there looking. What he would like is for the GPS reading on his suspects. If we can pull that off, he'll be a happy man. This is the missing piece. It's out there somewhere. The problem is the money. That ivory horn is worth somewhere between $75,000 and $85,000 if they can get it to China. Johan has no intention of allowing that to happen. Thank you all very much. Can I answer any questions? You can ask anything. Several of you always do. Okay? Thank you all very much.